two more regions left in our tour around the world. You can see why most books put this content into different chapters because it can be quite lengthy when you try to give each equal weight. So now we're going to be traveling to Southeast Asia. And in Southeast Asia, most non-settler colonies gain independence relatively peacefully. And there's not a ton of violence that happens within these different countries. An exception to that is definitely Vietnam. And this is partially because of the French hold in Vietnam and partially because of communism and arbitrary boundaries. Um, so one of the big problems with the government that was established in South Vietnam and supported by the West, but not necessarily by the Vietnamese, was that it was a Christian government that persecuted, oh, that is a rough spelling, persecuted Buddhists. And Buddhism was the majority religion in Vietnam. And to protest that, Thich Quang Duc, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation on, um, self-immolated or immolated himself, practiced self-immolation in 1963. He was protesting the persecution by Buddhists by Diem. And Diem was supported by both the United States and by France. And he burned himself to death in the middle of Saigon. And this put internal pressure on Diem to announce reforms saying that he wouldn't persecute against Buddhists. However, they were never implemented, and that led to a real deterioration. And there were national raids, and instead he launched national raids on Buddhist pagodas. And it was really, really bad. You can see why people did not want him to be a leader. He was going against his people. Many other monks emulated his example. Um, and eventually there was an army coup that toppled Diem, and he was assassinated in 1963. Now, the leader who wanted control of South Vietnam and who had control of North Vietnam was Ho Chi Minh. And you might remember him from the aftermath of World War I when he was educated in France, as many colonials were educated in those colonized countries. But he felt that Vietnam should be independent. So at first he had wanted democracy. When that did not work, when they did not grant the French did not grant independence to Vietnam, he turned to communism. And so he became the leader of North Vietnam. And in order to stop the spread of communism into the South, the Americans got involved. So again, this is like a French government originally. So Americans get involved after the military coup in South Vietnam in order to not allow the spread of communism from the north to the south. And in 1965, they start bombings. Vietnam has been bombed more than any other country in the 20th century. That's how many bombs are dropped in Vietnam. And this is partially because of arbitrary boundaries. Oh shoot, sorry. The U.S. Troops reached 550,000 by 1968. So as I'm sure you've learned in American history, it was a huge event. And by 1975, the United States had we pull a ceasefire in 1963 or 73. And pull out in 1975, and right after that, North Vietnam well, the South Vietnam falls to the North Vietnamese. So I'm sure you saw pictures like this, the style of warfare that was used in South Vietnam, but most of the style of Viet Cong was more guerrilla warfare tactics. And here we have coffins. Even though the United States had this huge military machine, they were not able to conquer the spirit of the Vietnamese. Moving into East Asia. East Asia is extremely complicated. I'm going to try to give you the basic bones and keep it as simple as possible. All right, so as we learned in previous flipped classrooms and from the book, communists in China were led for the most part by Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong in this picture is right there. And they were in a civil war against the nationalists who were led by Chiang Kai-shek, who is there. Let me mark that with a different color. And Chiang Kai-shek was definitely a friend of the West. Mao Zedong was definitely not. And during World War II, these two groups had had a ceasefire so that they could fight against the Japanese. But once the Japanese surrendered, the nationalists had a huge surge against the communists. But they were ousted, and Chiang Kai-shek fled to Vietnam. Or excuse me, oh my goodness. Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan. Oh, this is why today there is such a tense relationship between Taiwan and China, because Chiang Kai-shek also took the entire national treasury to Taiwan and claimed that it was China. So we actually did not recognize China as China for a very long time. So the People's Republic of China is established in 1949 with Mao Zedong as its leader. And Mao Zedong, and this is a picture of him establishing the People's Republic of China. Mao Zedong was from the start very suspect of the West, very suspect of elites, very suspect of basically of like the way things had been done in the past. He was very pro peasants, which made him extremely popular. All right, so China under communist rule. The peasants really supported the Chinese communists. And right away after the Chinese communists came into power, they redistributed land. So almost all of the land went into small holdings. And not only that, but there were large landlord tribunals where landlords were tried by not the fairest of courts, and they were either sentenced to labor camps or they were put onto or they were killed. They were executed. This redistribution of land did not last. Mao Zedong decided that it was very important for China to move forward technologically, and that he was going to use the Stalinistic style or Leninistic style 5-year plan. And so as part of that, he collectivized land. So he made these huge farms, and 90% of peasants were put onto those farms. In addition to that, he didn't trust cities. Remember, he was not a fan of elites. He was not a fan of urban culture. And so he said that, well, whatever can be done by these urbanites can be done by the Chinese in rural areas. So they decided that they were going to produce iron in literal backyard furnaces. Now this produced incredibly shoddy quality iron that you couldn't really use for anything in terms of industry. Also, there was just a lot of misinformation about what could and should be done. So, for example, the sparrow campaigns, the Chinese killed and chased sparrows and threw stones at them until they fell to the ground dead with exhaustion. They didn't allow them to eat because they felt they were, and they did, eating their seeds on their farm fields. But you know what they were also doing? Protecting those fields from bugs. And so when crops came in, there was no bird to stop insects. So all the crops that did make it were eaten. This great leap forward was actually a huge step backward. It was a total disaster. 20 million people died. 20 million people died. And this was catastrophic for China. However, they recovered fairly quickly. This was partially due to the fact that each of these farms was supposed to fulfill quotas, and they didn't make it, but they were too scared to tell their leaders that they didn't have enough food, and so people starved to death. Here you can see the birth and death rates, and here's the Great Leap Forward. Pretty shocking. All right. After that time period, China progressed industrially, and in 1965, Mao decided it was time for a new initiative, and this was the Cultural Revolution. This was another opportunity for him to attack scholars and bureaucrats. So he attacked the four olds: custom, culture, like Confucianism, habits, and ideas. So he was really attacking things that were traditionally elite. This was done through this thing called the Little Red Book, which was sayings by Mao. And you can see in this picture here, people in the countryside reading said red book. Here, these young leaders in China who represent the workers are carrying the Little Red Book. Very loyal communists. And these people represent the Red Guard, who were the youth. And they were basically in charge of spying and telling on elites. Many communist leaders actually spent time in work camps because of this program. Here's another great piece of propaganda from the Cultural Revolution. You can see Mao at the forefront, and then all of these different people in society: the worker, the military man, the nurse, the schoolgirl, the farmer, coming together to promote these ideas. Now, this is not what was really going on. This was an idealized version of what should be happening. After that, Mao dies soon after the revolution starts, but it is realized by people in the more moderate wing of the Communist Party that if this continues, then China is done for. So pragmatists took over. People like Deng Xiaoping, who became the next party leader in China. Here he is with Carter. Or, sorry. President Jimmy Carter, I mean. He allowed for some capitalist development and Western influences in China. He took away collectivization, or the last of it, and wanted more private peasant production and some private industry. So this is where we see the hybrid system that China has today. Still very autocratic, but a hybrid between capitalism and communism. There are continued challenges in China. One of the big challenges that China has faced and tried to combat is population control. For a long time in the 70s, it was like, have 2 kids. And then there was the one child policy, which you can see the impact here. So since the 1980s, and this was more of an urban policy. Have two kids in the rural areas, have one kid in the urban areas, and has some really huge impacts on obviously birth rates, but also gender ratios, which we'll explore more. Basically, there are way more men in China than there are women. But it does decrease population growth, which was its goal. There are also a lot of issues with China, and I'm sure this is not news to you, that with civil rights and democracy. One of the big examples of this is the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. Deng had sent many students to Western universities, and they came back wanting democratic reforms. Deng, because of his experiences with the Cultural Revolution, was very wary of these types of radical protests, and so he cracked down pretty harshly. Not pretty harshly, he harshly cracked down. And this resulted in a lot of, if you look up the Tiananmen Square protests in China today, you will not find anything about them. They were unsuccessful protests, and they showed the autocracy of the state. Also, freedom of the press, not really a thing in China. You can see this today in Hong Kong, which has struggled both with democracy and with freedom of the press, being a British protectorate until 1994 and then transferred back to China. They had a much more liberal society. Environmental challenges, pollution is a huge issue for the people of China and for the government, and because of this they've become one of the green energy leaders. However, they still have these massive factories and burning of coal, and that is resulting in just life-threatening smog. But overall, China's the largest economy in the world now. I mean, they have a huge success, and when you look at where they were in comparison to India, they've had a huge economic success. If you look at where they were in comparison with India in the 1950s, they were right there. And then China in the 1980s and 90s takes off and moves away from India. So this shows just how successful they have been economically at pushing their country forward. All right, our last region is Latin America, and we'll discuss that in the last portion.